Around 30,000 young men who climbed into B-24 Liberator bombers would never return from their missions. That's the equivalent of an entire medium-sized town wiped out because of the bombers' flaws and the high-risk missions they were sent on. By the war's end, half of all bombers were lost. And today we're going to show you why. Let's begin. Now let's start from the very beginning, so you'd understand how and why the B-24 became the most produced bomber ever, built in a staggering 18,500 units in total, but also why so disturbingly many airmen got killed in it. In 1939, the US Army Air Corps wanted more long-range bombers, but preferably with greater range, speed, and bomb payload than the already famous B-17 Flying Fortress. So, Consolidated Aircraft set out to create something like this and came up with the Model 32, soon to be designated the B-24. What was supposed to be high-efficiency Davis wings were put on a deep fuselage with twin tail fins. This wing gave the Liberator an impressive lift and range, which was crucial for bombing missions deep in enemy territory where other bombers couldn't reach. In 1941, testing was completed and the B-24 was entering production, and as the US entered the war, it would evolve rapidly. Everything looked promising on paper, especially as upgrades were fitted on, like a powered twin 50 caliber nose turret, better armor, and its 12,000-pound maximum bomb payload. However, it would soon get a chance to be compared with the proven B-17, and many glaring weaknesses would surface. Those very things that gave it impressive range and payload would become known all too well to the crews, and sadly for many of them, the reason they didn't survive the war. The Liberator was being produced at 5 giant plants, one of them being the famous Ford Willow Run factory, and the B-24 was rolling off assembly lines at record speed, with one being completed nearly every hour at the peak of production. Now this bomber had some quite interesting solutions. It had 4 engines, each giving about 1,200 horsepower and a crew of 10 men, them being pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and 6 gunners. They were sitting in quite cramped positions, with the narrow 9-inch wide catwalk through the bomb bay as the only path between crew compartments. Upgraded models would eventually have a standard of 10 50s, 2 in the waist and the rest positioned in powered turrets for all-around protection against enemy fighters. But there were some things they couldn't protect against. The Liberator was faster than the B-17 with a 300 miles per hour max speed, but had a lower operational ceiling which put it at slightly lower altitudes where the flak was more accurate. Combat range was about 2,000 miles, which was more than any other Allied heavy bomber at the time. Although the maximum weight of bombs it could carry was 12,000 pounds, this was rarely loaded in practice, as it could carry them only for about 400 miles. For longer sorties, where the Liberator would actually be used, typical payloads were up to 5,000 pounds. Its twin bomb bays had unique roller shutter doors that reduced drag as they didn't open downwards but rolled into the aircraft, which allowed it to maintain speed during bombing runs. Combat. Operational debut for the Liberator came in early 1942, and it was actually in the hands of the British Royal Air Force, who ordered them before the prototype was even finished. The Liberator's first job was long-range patrols over the Atlantic to cover the gap in air protection where German U-boats were wreaking havoc on Allied shipping going from America to Britain. No other aircraft could escort ships in that gap, and for this the B-24's long range was much appreciated, and actually helped turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. A couple of months later, B-24s began arriving in the hands of the US 8th Air Force based in England. They had until now been flying mostly B-17s, but soon 14 bomb groups with B-24s were formed. It was initially envisioned that they would operate together with the Flying Fortresses, but already the first operations proved this difficult to do. These two had very different cruising speeds, and because of that, the B-24s were separated into their own division. B-24s would soon be bombing Axis-occupied territory from Britain, North Africa, and then Italy. And like all other bombers, they suffered horrible losses to enemy fighter interceptors and flak. There are even recorded instances of B-24s captured by the Germans, used to approach and attack bomber formations, making the Allies think they were friendlies. Problems. Now let's explain the biggest flaws that earned the B-24 such a dark reputation from its crews. Let's start lightly with the Liberator being really hard to control in the skies. And remember, for the bombers to be somewhat safe from enemy fighter interceptors, which were the biggest threat, they had to stay in tight formation so they could mutually protect each other with machine guns, and also so that Allied fighter escort could keep them safe. Well, with the B-24, this wasn't possible as it was with the B-17, where one bomber's wings were literally under or above others. To maintain a formation, pilots had to constantly move the controls and adjust the bomber all the time. It was just an exhausting job, as the controls were also so heavy that the pilot and co-pilot would rotate every 15 minutes, German fighter interceptors would always attack B-24 formations rather than B-17s exactly because of this. Next thing, the Liberator couldn't take anywhere near the beating the Flying Fortress could. The Liberator had some armor plating around the crew seats and gun positions, but because of weight constraints, it was quite limited in coverage. An even bigger problem was that the fuel tanks were only partially self-sealing, so leaking fuel and catching fire quickly was definitely something you didn't want to happen in the air above enemy territory. And those revolutionary Davis wings that improved aerodynamics, well, they wouldn't stay together after a flak hit. Unlike the B-17 that limped home with such damage, it was hard to believe it was even flying at all. The B-24's wing, after being ruptured by a flak burst or fighters' machine guns or cannons, would disintegrate easily. The twin rudders and tail section were also vulnerable, and the whole bomber could be downed with a single well-placed hit. You remember that 9-inch wide catwalk we mentioned? Well, now imagine trying to bail out of a burning bomber spinning out of control with your bulky flight suit and parachute. Emergency escape hatches were also narrow and oddly positioned, so that's also part of the reason why so many aircrews went down together with their bomber. Another thing was the B-24's terrible landings on water in emergencies. It was prone to sink so quickly that the crew would drown in alarmingly many cases, and water ditching was not so rare, as they were often returning from missions with combat damage, especially in the Pacific over vast ocean. There were also all sorts of malfunctions. Crews said that all of a sudden an engine would just go out or spurt oil. However, the absolute worst day for the B-24 and its crews was yet to come in Operation Tidal Wave. It was August 1st, 1943, and one of the most important Allied air attacks was about to happen, with the B-24 Liberator now having to prove itself in an extremely difficult and dangerous mission. 178 B-24s divided into 5 groups were sent to bomb 9 oil refineries around Ploiești, Romania, in what was one of the largest bombing operations of the war. It was a high-stake, high-risk daylight mission and was kept in complete secrecy. Even the bomber crews thought they were flying into Palestine until the last second. You see, these refineries were providing Germany with about 60% of all its oil products, and as they were already in a fuel crisis, destroying more than half of this source could deal such a heavy strategic blow that it might end the war. But this wasn't the first time the Allies tried this. Already in 1942, B-24s attacked Ploiești and inflicted only small damage. However, the Germans now organized strong anti-aircraft defenses, along with hundreds of flak cannons there in case it happened again. Ploiești was now, after Berlin and Vienna, the most heavily defended target. General Louis Brereton insisted on this attack, saying that even if 50 bombers would be lost, it was a small price to pay for the success of the operation. He envisioned bombers approaching the target, flying dangerously low to avoid radar detection, and releasing bombs from just 250 feet. Commanders of bomber groups, upon hearing this, protested the order, but Brereton wouldn't hear them. Ploiești must be destroyed. Bombers would fly dangerously low for 2,400 miles to avoid radar detection, and each group had a specific target. They went from bases in Libya across the Mediterranean, then over Yugoslavia into Romania. However, they didn't know that their mission was doomed the moment they took off from their airfields, and from there everything would just get worse and worse. 3 German spies, not caught until 1944, informed the German High Command of the huge bomber formation going their way, and the mission was now compromised. However, crews in their bombers didn't know this. They were flying according to plan when a B-24 called Wongo Wongo suddenly began flying erratically and soon after crashed into the sea. Then the pilot of another B-24, who had just seen the bomber of his friend crash into the sea, ignored direct orders, broke formation, and returned to the crash site to see if there were survivors. They didn't find any, and they rushed back to catch up with the formation. But because of the huge weight of bombs and fuel, they couldn't reach them. They now had to turn back for Africa. In fact, 10 bombers would return to their bases after this crash due to confusion and the strict order to maintain radio silence. But 10 bombers less in a mission was not as big a problem as the fact that the one which returned to look for survivors and then couldn't catch up carried the deputy lead navigator for the entire mission. And if you wonder where the lead navigator was, well, he was in the bomber that had just crashed into the sea, killing everyone on board. The 2 most experienced navigators specifically trained for this mission were now out of action. Then as they went over Yugoslavia, groups ran into heavy cloud cover and formations began to break. To make everything even worse, they were soon detected by German radar. You see, groups were intended to attack Ploiești from various and least expected angles, but several errors were then made by navigators who had to take over the lead. Groups were now flying in the wrong directions and were forced to break radio silence, desperately trying to restore some form of order. Then all 5 groups managed to make it to their navigational checkpoint, 60 miles from Ploesti, from where they continued after their specific targets. But from there, everything descended into chaos. One group made a wrong turn and headed to Bucharest, where they encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire in addition to those awaiting them around Ploesti. Romanian and German fighters scrambled to intercept them, initially missed the bombers because they were looking for them at 16,000 feet where they usually operated, but they soon found them and attacked at low altitude. Bombers were now flying in range of every weapon from the ground, and carnage began. Soon after, the first B-24 went down, and then many more. Others broke formation under fire, trying to find their targets. They were dropping bombs from just 250 feet, while constantly taking fire from fighters and from the ground. Liberators were armed with 500 and 1,000-pound bombs, time-fused between 45 seconds up to 6 hours and complemented with incendiary bombs. This way, it was intended to make maximum damage and confusion. However, dropping bombs at such low altitude, and with time-fused bombs from previous bombers exploding as the next waves were coming, they were so close to explosions, flames, and smoke that subsequent waves were being hit by them. Some Liberators, badly shot up and leaking fuel, were ignited by the explosions from the ground. The whole mission just turned into one unbelievable, yet sadly very true and confirmed moment after another. For example, a Liberator named Old Baldy was so low that its machine gunners were firing at anti-aircraft crews on the ground. Then, an 88 hit them head-on, the bomber lost control, yet continued flying and crashed on top of the anti-aircraft cannon, killing the 10-man bomber crew and the 6-man gun crew. 2 other Liberators, flying literally at treetop level at just 50 feet, encountered the so-called Caterpillar, the disguised flak train. Gunners realized what it was and opened fire, disabling the locomotive and killing some of the crew. Bomber Jose Carioca was shot by a Romanian fighter and crashed into Ploesti Women's Prison, destroying the 3-story building in an explosion and killing over 50 people. Surviving B-24s were now turning around and speeding back towards their bases. However, this wasn't the end, and horribly many of them wouldn't reach safety. Hundreds of fighters now swarmed on the battered bombers, whose already exhausted gunners frantically tried to fend them off. One by one, B-24s were leaving a trail of burning crash sites, with only a few parachutes seen in the sky before the bombers hit the ground. When General Brereton said confidently that even 50 bombers lost would be a small price to pay, he probably couldn't even imagine that by the mission's end, 73 B-24s would be lost, and over 500 American airmen killed or wounded. 55 more bombers were heavily damaged and about 100 airmen were captured. The mission earned 5 Medals of Honor, 3 of them posthumously, the most for any single air action in history. An additional 56 Distinguished Service Crosses and 41 Silver Stars were awarded. And to add insult to injury, most of the damage inflicted on refineries was repaired within weeks, and the fuel output was even higher than before the raid. However, this didn't mean the Allies would stop trying to knock out the refineries, and there would be more missions, although on a smaller scale. By the war's end, well over 200 Allied bombers were lost in attacks just on them. Bomber crews of the Second World War really had disturbingly high proportions of losses, and they also contributed to hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths on the ground, especially its successor, the B-29 Superfortress, later in firebombing and nuking Japan. They at least had some humanitarian missions as the war drew to a close, like when Dutch civilians were cut off by the Germans and left without food. B-24s were then converted to drop instead of bombs, tons of crates with food and rations, and its bomb bay proved actually quite useful for this purpose. When the war ended, the B-24 disappeared surprisingly quickly, with almost every single one being scrapped within just 1 year after the war.